Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Chatting the Pictures. I'm Cara Finnegan. I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw. I'm a psychologist, a writer, and publisher of Reading the Pictures.
So we have a number of events of all different kinds this week, Michael. Kind of an emotional roller coaster, you might say, of happenings in the news this week, yeah?
Yeah, it is sort of a come to Jesus kind of week in a way, in terms of some of these crucial issues and then critical events bringing them to the fore.
Yeah, exactly. So why don't we dive in? As folks know who follow us, our first segment we call the news, which is where we explore how news photographs tell a story and how do we understand the information that a news photo provides. So here is this week's photo.
This photo was absolutely viral for days. It was taken by Hagen Hopkins for Getty Images. The caption reads, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern hugs a mosquegoer at the Kilbirnie Mosque on March 17th in Wellington, New Zealand. And then it goes on to say how 50 people were confirmed dead and 36 were injured in the mosque attack on Friday the 15th.
One of the things that I always think about when I look, especially at a photo that marks a news event, like this one in particular, is where the photographer puts us in relation to the subjects of the photo. And one of the things I think is really compelling about this as a news image is that we are right there with them, with her greeting this group of people at the mosque and hugging this woman and consoling this group of people. And if you think about kind of where the photographer is, there's kind of a circle, right, gathered around these two women. And that notion of kind of being in there with them seems to echo a lot of the way that the story, particularly of how the Prime Minister engaged this event, it seems to echo that pretty closely, I thought.
Yeah, the symmetry is really powerful. And I don't know, I want to say organic, which is strange because, we're always aware doing this about photo ops and about the media lens and the performative aspect of politics. But, if you look at her eyes, and also, I also have some context looking at the video of all of this. So there's a little bit more of a larger frame, but, her emotional countenance seems to transcend the presence of the cameras. And I don't know, like, if that's even possible, but the way she took time with each person when she visited these mosques, it was so intimate. And, it's the closest and probably the only time you might hear me ever say that it felt like the presence of the cameras made no difference. But it really feels that way.
And that's really interesting, the way you described it as organic, because the presence of everyone else around them kind of cues that too, that there's the gentleman standing off to the left in the background who is, taking pictures, right? So you get the sense that this is a mediated event. But to me, that's punctuated and offset a little bit by that box of Kleenex, which just sort of sits there as a resource and as a reminder of, again, kind of why we're here. The other thing I think is really interesting about this photo, particularly from a gendered component, thinking about Ardern's role as a female leader, thinking about especially the worldwide press she got for not only actually having a baby while in office, like shockaroo, but then bringing it, bringing her child to the floor of the UN. And so, so she's known not only as a young female leader, but she's known as a mother. And so there's this gendered component of the two women hugging, both with the black head covering. You can't see the other woman's face. So there's a kind of parallelism there, which, you could say a lot of things about, oh, well, this proves that we need more women leaders because they're nurturing and, they know what to do in these tragic situations. That's all fine. But to me, what's really interesting about this photo is that we got a very different Ardern when it came time for her to make some arguments about what they were going to do about guns in New Zealand. And there you got the same person, but a very different orientation. So I guess what I mean by that is this is a moment where she was doing what was needed in the moment and required in the moment, and by all accounts did it very well. But I think what we would want to do is be careful to then assume that, oh, this is why women are better because they are so feminine and womanly, et cetera, because she's proven she can be tough in other contexts. So to me, this represents somebody who's very, very skilled at addressing whatever context she's in.
She's really stretching. And in fact, the perfect example of what you're saying is this photograph that we put on our Twitter feed a couple hours ago, taken, I believe, from one of the funerals, but it shows a woman, police officer with a semi-automatic rifle in New Zealand, and she's in her uniform, so she's literally dressed for anything, but at the same time she's wearing a hijab, and she also has a rose pinned into her lapel. So it's just, and you look at that picture and you think about this, sure, that spectrum of tough to incredibly empathetic and warm and maternal, but you also get you really do get the full spectrum.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting about that from a gendered perspective is that to a certain extent maybe women are becoming freer to move along that spectrum, and Adern might represent a path to that, I guess you could say. I mean, certainly not. That is not the most important thing about the situation. Let me be very clear about that. And
but she's quote unquote modeling it.
Yeah, but in other words, there's a kind of path or a way to be multiple kinds of things, right? And I think that is interesting, and this photo really taps into that one particular side, right? And so that I think makes it pretty compelling. Shall we move on?
Yep.
Our next segment we call The Look, and here is where we are interested in how photos might push the visual boundaries in a way that illuminates a story or an idea, perhaps in a slightly different or unexpected way. And here's this week's photo.
So I'm really excited about this. All kinds of funny things started happening yesterday when we posted this photograph on our site. It's taken by a really great Washington photographer, Jacqueline Martin, who's been shooting for the AP for a while. The caption reads, Havana Chapman-Edwards, 8 years old, of Washington, poses for a portrait with a chalkboard of her age in 2030, the point where the globe would be struck on a path toward what scientists call planet-changing dangerous warming, taken Friday, March 15th, during a climate change rally of students in Washington. So the photo is tied to the international student strike that took place in over 100 cities, so mostly by kids, in the name of climate change. The photo is part of an AP collection. They also tweeted us this yesterday, where there's actually 10 different children all picking up the same concept. And then another thing that was interesting yesterday is that Meg Handler, who is our editor at large for Reading the Pictures, she realized that this woman in this girl in the picture, Havana, was the same girl who got a lot of attention almost exactly a year ago, because she was the only one who walked out of her first grade class in Virginia as part of this national school walkout for gun reform. So we also put up the two pictures yesterday on Twitter, and what was very cool is Havana retweeted it almost immediately. Her tag is the tiny diplomat. And that picture, if you look on the Twitter, or if you recall it, she was wearing an astronaut uniform. Mm-hmm. That's so interesting. She's really got her symbolism down. So a lot of different things going on with this photograph, just in terms of backstory.
Yeah, and I mean, and it also gives you. I mean, to me, that story just is doing what the photo does, which is it's telling it's telling the beginnings of a story of a generation of activists, right? And I think
Yeah.
Havana and a lot of kids like her are showing their interest in thinking about their future and what kind of future they may have and what kind of future they might not have because of policy decisions we make today in a variety of contexts.
Yeah.
To me, the whole group of photos does this, but this image of Havana in particular does it really well. It's a school photo. It looks like a school photo.
Yeah.
But then my question is, who is schooling who, right?
Yeah.
Havana is, posed in a way that might not be all that different from the way, you might pose for a yearbook when you're older or for some kind of school photo. You're in the grass, you're, she's got the beautiful flowers in her hair, she's wearing her jewelry. So she's kind of fully herself in her mode, as a young kid. But at the same time, that chalkboard in front makes you go, okay, well, what's that about, right? And then when you get the sense that this is how old she will be in 2030, then she is schooling us. She's schooling us in, something that photography doesn't do very well. Photography kind of can snap the moment in the present, and it can certainly do a lot with the past, but photography isn't very good at the future. And I think this photo really gets us to do what I think the march was doing and what the walkout was doing, and what these kids want us to do, which is like, please think about the future. Think about me at 19.
Yeah, I think this photo, just in terms of Havana herself, and then in terms of the whole concept, is really doing a lot of really interesting things. Like you said before, the problems in the society now, climate change, gun control, human rights, are spawning this whole generation of young activists. The Parkland kids have just we watched them grow. And what's interesting in this photo is that Havana now representing not gun reform, but now climate change. But if you look at her bracelet, you also see the bands, for LGBT. So she's really got that activist profile. And then the other thing I really like about this a lot is her face. And I think, like you were saying, this thing about photos don't do the future that well, but I think that her expression is just surprisingly complex. If you just look at her eyes, and even if you're moving your hand on different parts of the photograph, her eyes look more hopeful, idealistic, they're future forward. It's a look that, an expression, a position that we're familiar with. But if you look at her mouth looks much more expectant and demanding, even a little disappointed. And when you put all of that together, you get a lot of complexity.
That's a really interesting point. And if you just think visually, the way the photo is structured with that, the chalkboard kind of propped up, right diagonal down from that line, right, from her face. Yeah. And yeah, you're right. It's a kind of dialectic, it's sort of 19 plus her face plus whatever she is facing, whatever she's looking at in the future. Yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. And the other thing I would point out of that whole group of photos that I think is really important to think about, particularly in the context of the questions about climate change, is that series of AP photos by Martin is a very diverse group of students, particularly in terms of race and ethnicity, and also a little bit in age. And so you also get the sense of the kind of kids who are going to be the future, literally, and you also get the sense of the extent to which they are aware now, right, of the uncertainty of that future in the context of issues like climate change.
And you
so
saw that awareness
the diversity component, I think, is a really important part of the story too, which is all kinds of kids from all kinds of backgrounds are going to be affected, and kids from certain kinds of backgrounds are going to be affected more than others and are already. And that's also something I think that these photos invite us to think a little bit about, particularly if you think of us, quote unquote, as the audience of policymakers.
Yeah, and the Parkland kids were very conscious about that right out of the, almost immediately, and we're reaching out to other students around the country and young people who are like victims of gun violence every day, and not, necessarily extraordinary events that, that occur and get all the media attention. So I think your point's well taken.
Yeah, yeah. Shall we move on to our last segment here? This is called The Pick. And this is where we look at photos that seem to be a good editorial choice in terms of the way that they picture an event. And here's this week's image.
This shot was taken by Herschel Talley. I think from the way that it's credited, I think that it was probably someone, a citizen, who took this on social media, and it got picked up by Reuters. I think, or either that or he works for the Nebraska National Guard, one of the two. The caption reads, "Flooded Camp Ashland, an Army National Guard facility, is seen in Ashland, Nebraska, March 17th, just in terms of background." And we probably need some background, because between what happened in Zimbabwe this week with this killer cyclone that killed 500 people, and then this literally historic flooding that happened in Nebraska and Iowa, 3 people were killed, the roads were flooded, a nuclear power plant was flooded, a significant portion of the U.S. Air Force Base was flooded there. This was literally what they call a bomb cyclone winter storm. And I know you're in the Midwest. We've been talking about this. So,
a lot of farmers lost all their livestock. Which of course means all their dollars. Yeah, and they'll
never be back in business. So, we're talking about this terrible irony of, quote unquote national defense here. It's and then the question of, what are we investing in, and what are we fighting for?
Yeah. I mean, I keep kind of my eyes bounce back and forth in this photo between the tank, right, the very incongruously tank that seems to be floating, and that stop sign at the bottom left of the screen, and as kind of emblems of the state. And I guess the power lines would be too, right? So there's a grid, there's a state, there's a structure of defense, as you say, of safety and security, that this water doesn't care about that at all, right? So to me, that's kind of the first thing. The second thing I think that the photo does, and I don't really know what to make of it in terms of some kind of broader meaning, but I'll just toss it out there, is the reflections on the water double everything. So you've got a tank and then an upside down tank, and a stop sign and an upside down sign, and the trees and the power lines. And so, maybe one way to read that doubling might be just to say, like, it's actually worse than you think, or it's worse than it looks, right? Maybe it's twice as bad. I don't know. But that doubling, to me, it's an effect of the fact that the water is relatively calm, but maybe that, but that doesn't mean the water isn't also at the same time dangerous and deadly, right?
Well, I think that's what struck me, was the calmness, and with all these events taking place, and then talk about symbolism. Trump yesterday went to this tank manufacturing plant in Ohio. So we have this, and we go back to Havana and to climate change, and it seems like the kid's the only one that get it. Maybe that's going to change with, once the 2020 campaign really gets into full swing. But, this is the silent but deadly poster. And it's the creeping disaster, and the fact that, you can't watch a pot boil. It's like we are slowly getting wiped out, and, when we're so concerned about civil strife and militarism and chest beating, and and here are our bases are getting flooded. It's like, when is we're past the wake up call, and this is the silent but deadly.
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying that, Michael, I'm thinking about so some of my early work in the history of photography was on photographs made in the 1930s and the Dust Bowl, right? And you can probably, some of you, conjure them up in your mind as I mentioned that, what those images looked like. But that was an environmental disaster that had to be pictured in order for people to understand what was going on. And it strikes me that, you know, the event-based nature of these kinds of, you know, the bomb cyclone, these kinds of weather moments, you know, maybe that's our 21st century version of the Dust Bowl. And the question then becomes, do these photos of these dramatic events or the terrible impact of these events make a difference or not in terms of the broader policy questions? And then I think back to the photo of Havana and think about the people who did the walkout and, you know, the students and the young kids, and they seem all connected somehow, right? As you said.
Yeah, I mean, like the kids are the stop sign, and it, you know, you don't want the once the stop sign goes under, you know, we don't have the guidance, we don't have the warning, or even these power poles. They're functioning. You can see how it's kind of saturated at the bottom. They're like level markers, you know. But you know, at a certain point, the indicators and the warnings, you know, we just blow right past. We blow through them. So it's terribly frustrating. I hope that we're getting to a tipping point politically here on climate change, because, you know, these ingenious, or very clever, not clever, but creative ideas in terms of how to depict, you know, counting backwards from 2030 is great, and it's helpful. But, you know, at a certain point, you know, you need that kind of critical mass, that kind of effect. So I don't know.
Yeah. So maybe photography's power is not only to represent, but now to circulate, right? So you make these photos so that they will get around.
It's trying every which way.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
exactly.
Yep.
So that wraps us up for this week. Any final words or statements for us?
I did a post yesterday on the photograph from the Ethiopian Airlines crash site of the woman who is Ethiopian woman, I believe, throwing dirt in her face, and how you can read that, or it actually does present itself differently, both to a Western audience as opposed to someone from the East who understands that kind of grief reaction. Good example of
images tapping into elements of culture that you may or may not necessarily understand. For sure. Yeah.
Otherwise, you know, just follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and we're just, as it's coming, we're trying to deconstruct it.
All right. Doing our best.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.